Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner from the Break It Down Show, wishing you all a very Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah. Today's episode features Marine Rifleman Chad Cole, who has written a book called Dirty Little Wars. Here's the thing. So there was a gap in time between the conflicts that we've had now for almost 20 years where we weren't really sure what to do and where to go and how to do it. So we sent a bunch of service members over to Somalia and Mogadishu, and that went as well as that went. I guess we all know the story of Black Hawk Down and how challenging it is to deal with warlords. We also had the Rodney King riots, and this is something that was new to me that we found out in the show, was that Chad and his group of Marines were deployed internally in the U.S. with loaded magazines. This is the Marines deployed inside America. That is exceptionally rare, and trying to work in real time without real training on collaborating with the police in a combat zone. So the police are sort of elevated to this paramilitary force during the riots, and the Marines are sort of a detuned Marine unit because you can't just have Marines whacking people left and right. And yet, there they are, engaged in active combat with a lot of people in an uncertain area. Fascinating story. This is co-produced and co-hosted by my man, Pete Koch, hashtag #ThePete's. Getting this story in. Chad and Pete, man, I just love this conversation. And I hope you guys all buy Chad's book. It's called Dirty Little Wars, and you can get it at his website at thedirtylittlewars.com, or just go to Amazon and take a look at his book. He's a hell of a dude, super awesome. He lives in Texas, and I just can't say enough positive things about this guy that I've met because he's just a wonderful guy. Hey, support the show. Here's what you can do. One, there are new shirts up on the Break It Down show. You can either get the standard traditional white logo shirt or also our Macedonian flag logo shirts, which I bought a bunch of yesterday. So that's a great way to support the show. Put a couple dollars in the pocket, and I'll take that, and I'll go on the road, and I'll find more people to talk to and bring back to you. Or you can share, or you can talk about the show to your friends, or you can say, hey, Pete, go get this expert on this topic. I want to be on this show. Or you can just say, hey, this would be fascinating. Try to get to this person. Or any kind of engagement, any kind of sharing of the show, any kind of participation with a little bit of money definitely goes a long way. We are working on some very big things, and I'm really excited, and I know you guys are going to be stoked about it. The Prison Chronicles is probably 65% of the way done. I'm already through episode 1 and just about done with episodes 2 and 3. Those are going to come out, and they're just going to blow your doors off. So there's a lot of great things coming. This is what we all do. This is how we support one another. Thank you all so much. SaveTheBrave.org. It's the end of the year right now. And if it's not the end of the year when you listen to this, it's a good time to get started. Save the Brave. SaveTheBrave.org. Click on the donate tab. Put a dollar amount in each month and just say, bing, I'm doing something to help these guys out. You know that I'm passionate about this. Their logo was on everything that we do. I'm always talking about it. They're my go-to charity. Now that I've said all of that stuff, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Here comes Chad Cole.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Chad Cole, the author of The Dirty Little Wars, and you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, it's Pete and Pete coming straight at you. And one of the things I love about doing this is that you get to access other people that people find interesting. In this case, Pete Koch said, "Hey, Pete, let's grab Chad Cole. He's a veteran. He's right up our alley. Of course, we love our Marines around here." And so it's awesome to have Pete on the show with me today, co-hosting. Pete, tell us a little bit about Chad.
Well, Chad and I met through social media and developed a friendship there and got a little T-shirt business. We'll discuss that. I'm interested to sort of unpack, where he's going with that. And I'm always interested to talk about business and his hopes. And that's a topic that he and I have discussed over the past year. But in addition to that, or in front of that, I've come to learn as a military veteran, and we like to always remember to thank him for his service and all the good that he's done for our country. And here's a guy that resides in America's heartland, Waco, Texas. And I'm always, interested to learn the values and the ways sort of that people think as they go about their lives and their business. what really motivated me to reach out to Pete Turner and say, we've got to talk to Chad about this, is that he wrote a book. And I have so much admiration for anybody who writes a book, because writing anything, I'm starting to write a newsletter myself, and I go in fits and starts. And that writing process is very, very challenging. So I'd like to start there, Chad, tell us about your book, Dirty Little Wars.
Great. Well, I thank you for having me on here, this has been a neat journey already. I was telling the guy when I was on the last podcast I did, I figured out right away that the journey here, that has been the biggest reward. As soon as I published this book, I did it independently through Amazon. I started immediately meeting really awesome people that were reaching out to me for various reasons, being whether it was people that I served with or people who are interested in the book and that kind of thing. So this has been really neat all the way to this point. I just got to say, going on what you just now said, Pete, about you had just started a newsletter, you're interested in the writing process, for anyone who's written a book. And I can tell you as an advocate, not only for my own work, but to speak for or to motivate all potential writers, if you have the inkling or you've got a little bit of that passion on you to do this, I think it's important to do it, especially for guys like me who wrote a memoir, like in your case, Pete, things you remember from the NFL or whatever, all your time in Hollywood. I would recommend that, get started right away, just jotting things down, do it when you can. And at some point you have to make time, you have to kind of reprioritize time. But for the main reason, if for no other reason, and this is what I've said several times now since August when my book came out, is the fact that whether you believe me or not, you actually will you'll forget a lot of the things that you think you're never going to forget. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so
Sure
and I've just got to say this. I started working on The Dirty Little Wars. It had a different title. It doesn't even matter now. There's a neat little story about that. But around, let's say 2000, 2001 timeframe is actually when this manuscript was actually a big part of my undergraduate degree. I was actually getting core curriculum credits. I have a bachelor's degree in history, and this was counted towards several hours worth of independent study. So I had a professor who was really hammering away at this manuscript, and a lot of red ink, a lot of corrections, a lot of back and forth, and lots of deadlines and things that really kind of pulled the work out of me in a way that made it better. And so all these years later, to come to where we are now, after the final workings with an editor in New York, and going over the final changes, and I had to force myself to put on blinders and to only look at the corrections and changes that the editor was suggesting. Because as a writer, it's like you look at a painting and you can't put the paintbrush down, or
Right.
you're trying to remodel your house and you can't let it go, and you have to just step back and stop. One of the last times that I had tried to edit and do some proofing on my own, I ended up cranking out probably another 75 pages.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from the Break It Down Show, checking in real quick to ask you this. John, Scott, and I all support Save the Brave with our time, our location, our effort, and our money. Each month we give a small amount. Do the same with us. Go to savethebrave.org, click on the donate tab, pick an amount that you want to come out each month, and they will handle all the rest. I stand behind these folks. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the show.
One of the last times that I had tried to edit and do some proofing on my own, I ended up cranking out probably another 75 pages in the editing process, which is great, and I'm thankful for it, but it's not a productive way to continue to write. In other words, you got to step back and let the paint dry. So I was working with this editor. I had on the blinders. I only focused on what he said to do, and it was a major leap of faith. So then I put it away. It was finished. So I dusted off, so to speak, a couple of years later, and I self-published it on my own. And I literally had not read this book cover to cover until I had my own copy of the paperback in my hand, right? And so the reason I mentioned getting started on your own project, and I encourage everyone that you can do this, you just have to make it happen, but do it before, the material goes cold or you forget, because there was a huge part of my book that I actually had forgotten about completely. So my book, it's a military memoir, so to speak. That's certainly the genre that it falls in, but it is not a typical linear narrative of my life story. That's not what the book is about. And so anyone that's already read it, if they're listening, they're nodding their heads because they understand this book is actually about storytelling, the importance of storytelling. And as far as it goes for the Marine Corps, what I describe as the Marine Corps myth, living up to the myth, even for Army veterans or really any veterans, the idea of living up to those who came before you. It's no different than, Pete gets drafted by the Raiders and he knows who the Raiders are and what that legacy of that franchise is. And he understands who Al Davis is. And, it's like, God, we've got to do what the 76 Raiders did. Or does that make sense?
Yeah.
So a big theme in my book is actually living up to those that came before us and the retelling of stories, the importance of these stories that we pass on. And so huge chunks of my book are actually about Desert Storm and the Vietnam War.
Let me ask you a question here, because Chad, you said an interesting thing. And, as an Army guy, we don't love the Army like you guys love the Marines, right? So when I look at the Army guys that are a generation older than me, yeah, I respect their experience. I respect their rank, and the fact that they've been wherever and done whatever. But I'm not irreverent towards them. I don't necessarily want to be like them. What's the difference, do you think? What is it about older Marines that you guys lock onto? Because there's definitely something there that you guys have.
It's real. And I think I will take that as a compliment as a Marine. For starters, for those who've been through Marine Corps recruit training, 13 weeks of training, and first phase of training includes pretty intense learning and study of the Marine Corps history. So you are getting a real hands-on, and you're tested on this knowledge of, when the Marine Corps was founded and who founded the Marine Corps. And, the Marine Corps birthday is coming up November 10th. And, and Marines learn the history, and it is, take it further. It's not that we learn the history. It is ingrained in us that the history is important. Does that make sense? It's not just, hey, learn this, but it's, hey, this is who we are. This is why we're here. This is what makes us unique. And this is our legacy. And so you're learning, the names and the battles and the dates and the places, and you're actually having to repeat these things on tests. And, you have to be able to demonstrate this knowledge, right? And so you learn that in the beginning. And then once you get out into the Marine Corps, and I described this, and you were in the Army, correct?
Right.
So you know the deal, like you were stationed, at whatever base you were stationed at. As soon as you had a little bit of money in your pocket on the, and you got turned to, and this is as early as when you're in your first or second school as a brand new private or whatever, you go to the base exchange, we call it the PX. You go to the PX, there's the magazine and book section there in the PX. And, you see all the soft cover, the paperbacks of Vietnam War, World War II, memoirs, and that sort of a thing. Am I ringing a bell here?
Yeah, there's all that stuff for sure. What I was going to ask Pete, do you have the same vibe where the older NFL players, when you're there and you're a young guy, yeah, they're established and everything, but are they bigger than that for you guys?
I think it varies. That's a good question. I remember when I very first got into the league, I can sort of compare and contrast two guys that were both on that team. I'm thinking about the Bengals. I was drafted by the Bengals. We had a couple of guys that were both in their 9th or 10th year. And one of them conducted himself in such a way that, he really looked down and spoke down to the younger players. And another guy who had been on a team equally as long, a more decorated player, treated everybody just, equally. It really stood out in my mind. Needless to say that behavior is counterproductive to a team game. The guy that looked down on the players, he was not a well-liked human being. Then the other guy that just sort of treated everybody on the same plane, regardless of your experience. He was beloved.
Interesting.
It's an interesting question, but how somebody, it's a culture, right? I know that the Army, it's like everyone thinks, sort of there's this notion that they think of the Marines, as a non-military person, right? So you think of the Marines as a smaller group of soldiers, and it's a bit more elite. And then the Army is by sheer volume, by sheer mass, of how many troops they have, they tend to dominate, situations. At the end of the day, it's that volume of people that makes them so powerful and great. So, but within that culture, but then again, there's slightly different cultures. Because I have so many friends in military, even Air Force and certainly Navy, it is interesting to speak with them about the cultures, the differences in the cultures. And having played myself for 3 different NFL teams, I could tell you that the football's the same, the field's the same, the equipment's the same, every place you go. But the culture there is quite different. And that really starts at the top in the case of the NFL, because NFL teams are so small. I tell people is imagine that you went to work and your office was 53 people. That's what the locker room is, and you got 53 players, and then you got about 15 coaches and about another 10 supporting staff of equipment managers and trainers, and there's your entire workplace, about 80, 90 people every single day. Except that organization right there is a $1 billion company, but it really boils down to about 80, 90 people. The stakes are high. But that is how it works. Compare that to being in the Army, and I couldn't even imagine, because it's so massive. I guess that's why it needs to all be broken down into squadrons or units and things like that. You would know all about that. But I find the whole idea of working within a community to be an interesting topic. I sure do.
Chad, your book is called The Dirty Little Wars, and it's about your time dealing with the LA riots in Somalia. Give us a little bit of that. That's such a, they're not even modern fights, but they are, because, they happened. But how does, when you deploy internally inside the United States, it's because there's a crisis. And that's different than going somewhere like Somalia, where there's a human crisis. Can you compare and contrast what those experiences were like for you?
Good question. Well, some of the similarities there were, the fact that each operation was unique. Like, when we went into Somalia, we were actually the last, or I should say, there were no American troops in Somalia when we went into Mogadishu to pull out the last remaining United Nations troops that were there. So there was Pakistani and Bangladeshi troops, and they were the final elements of the United Nations effort there. So we went in there and got them out. That was we literally, mopped our way out, turned out the lights, and there were no more people there, right? And so kind of a unique deal. We weren't part of the larger deployment, like typically when the typical Marine who served in Operation United Shield, which is what we were a part of, typically for guys like us, it's, oh, you were in Somalia? Oh, you mean Black Hawk Down, right? And it's actually, well, no, that happened, a year and a half before we went in there. And so it's kind of, you have to explain that in the same way we would have to explain to people that we had been deployed to go into Los Angeles as a part of the outcome of the Rodney King trial.
Right. Yeah.
As far as being in an urban environment, it's not total war. Obviously, we had not declared war in Los Angeles, and we're not Somalia. The operations in Somalia were not, it was not war. We had, Congress had not declared war. It's, these low intensity conflict is the phrase that we used at the time. So, you may be engaged in a humanitarian mission, and then 30 minutes later, you may be in sustained combat. We're not going force on force with another established army, because in Mogadishu, this was after there had been a coup, a revolution, the government had been dissolved. There were warring factions that were fighting for territory and influence, and power, and all that. And so, even the combat element of what we did was really more in line with fighting the modern day, like the Mujahideen, or the like when in the the early days after Iraq, quote unquote, had been liberated, or the mission accomplished banner was flying on the aircraft carrier, and now the war really started. Where there was the insurgency that began, and now you're fighting forces that don't have conventional conventional uniforms and that sort of thing, right? So definitely, the non-conventional experience is what makes the LA riot and then the Somalia deployment sort of a common deal, right? I think I had just turned 20 years old. I got to my unit, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, in the beginning of March. I think it was March of 1992, and then by May of 92. So this is just 2 months in. We had been on Air Contingency Battalion. I'm sure you remember doing those sorts of things where you'd be on air alert, So we were just taking our turn on air alert, where we would, we had all our gear packed, and we're doing gear inspections 4 and 5 times a day. We'd pull all our gear out and lay it out, and it'd be inspected, and you'd pack it back in your packs and just stage it away, just playing games and things that make most infantry, pissed off and frustrated,
Yeah.
And we literally had come to the end of our tenure there on the ACB, Air Contingency Battalion. It was a Thursday, and some of the guys, would be watching TV every night in the little lounge as that trial was winding down, and it looked like they were going to come out with a verdict for all those cops. They had beaten up Rodney King. Y'all know the deal. I mean, and Pete was probably out there too,
I remember it vividly.
And so, we were watching the trial as it came to an end, and the verdict came down, and I believe it was on a Thursday night. And I had, and I talk about this in the book, but we had a scheduled regimental formation for the whole 1st Marine Regiment that following morning, Friday morning. And we were supposed to just go to that formation, do the bells and whistles kind of deal, hand salutes, and then get turned to on a 3 or 4 day weekend. And then instead we were called to, to go participate in this. There was a special purpose, task force being put together because the rioting had already started. And this literally was from a Thursday to a Friday, and the city was already on fire. Like, that's how fast that happened. If you remember, it wasn't like it was a slow buildup to where they finally had to call in the Marines. The National Guard had been called in almost immediately. And then not to bust on them too much, but I think they were a little bit overwhelmed with what they were doing and maybe spread a little too thin. But they called up our whole battalion, sent us up to Tustin Air Station, did some things there, talk about that in the book a little bit too. And then they sent us up into LA, and as we got closer into the city, the company, the convoys started breaking off into smaller convoys and then smaller convoys, as each platoon was basically going to their area that they were going to protect or whatever. And my platoon ended up in Compton, at the Compton Fashion Center is the name of the building. It's actually still there. It's an indoor flea market type deal,
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy how the internet works. 20 something years later, I've actually Googled the place and looked at it on the map. And when you're looking at an aerial map, you're like, wow, that kind of looks like the same area, I guess. But we got up there, everything around it was burned to the ground. It was a pretty eye-opening experience because, like you said, we're not at war, or what are we here for? We're deployed in the United States. There was quite a bit of back and forth about what weapons to use and how much ammunition to have, and
Do you remember what your
that
rules
kind
of
of deal.
engagement were in LA?
Yeah. So the rules of engagement were a lot of the standard rules of engagement that involve the use of or the escalation of deadly force, up to and including deadly force in the effort of self-defense and in the defense of others and that sort of thing, right? I know that from the Army. Just some so I'm saying those were the foundational rules of engagement. Now, we weren't there to seize objectives and things like that. There's a story that floats around, and it's a true story, but it's crazy how these true stories kind of trickle down through the years. But as far as rules of engagement go, there was an element from our battalion that is the way I remember it. They were actually at a checkpoint guarding, an area that had a kind of a checkpoint, maybe even some sandbags or whatever, or they're standing around a wall, some sort of way where Marines and soldiers are going to always try to take cover of some kind, right?
Right.
And apparently there were, I think LAPD was in pursuit of some criminals of some kind, and they passed by the Marines' position as these suspects fled into a house. And as the police passed by the Marine positions, they yelled to the Marines, "Cover us." And now, if you you say that to the wrong people, cover means something completely different.
Yeah.
In the Marine Corps or in an infantry unit.
Tell us what cover me means in the Marine Corps.
Yeah. Well, what it meant on that particular moment was that those 3 or 4 Marines immediately opened fire on this building and laid down suppressive covering fire so that these police could move, up onto the objective or whatever it was, cover fire, right?
Yeah.
And so we hear this. Now, keep in mind, give me the slight disclaimer, even as a Marine who was there, I did not see this happen with my own eyes. I did not hear the rounds go off. This is just the word that we got, like, holy shit. Some of these guys, and I think it was Kilo, Marines from Kilo Company 3-1, that had, lit up this house. And I think it worked because we had heard that the suspects, very quickly threw down their arms and they came out hands up and the police arrested them. And, and from that moment on, I think the police and the Marines had to work out the language they would use, but, the place where we were, we had LA County sheriffs, the LAPD, and several of the other law enforcement agencies. It seemed like they would either come through our positions. I don't know if it almost felt like they were coming to see us and we were animals in a zoo exhibit, because it's like word was getting out that the Marines had been called into LA, what the fuck are the Marines doing here? And so all these people were coming to see us, and then they'd hang around and rub elbows, and then they'd leave in their squad car and in more car. We're like, what are we doing here? Should we be charging admission for this? But yeah, we were there in Compton for 10 days, and then everything had calmed down and they pulled us back to Tustin. And then from there, we ended up back at Camp Pendleton.
It's funny. I live right by Tustin Air Station, or, what it is now.
Oh, yeah.
I've deployed, and I know that if you throw rounds downrange, at least in the Army, they're going to want to know how many rounds you fired. Have to account for every single thing. So for someone to say to you guys, cover me, and you guys do, not obviously you specifically, but it's a significant bet. Like, you're betting your career at this point.
Oh, yeah.
I want people to understand, like, what a big risk that is. You're doing what you're told, but that guy isn't your boss either. That's pretty significant.
Well, and I mean, even in, we talk about the comparing and contrasting here, but like even in the combat we got into in Mogadishu, there was a very high level of, stress and almost paralysis by analysis, worrying about whether or not we should engage targets or, even in the heat of the moment there, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, but everyone was not on the same page as to whether we should be killing these people who were shooting at us or not. Just put it that way. As we were under direct heavy machine gun fire, there was a debate going on within the company, I will say, as to whether we were, even effectively, whether we should have engaged or, understand. I know you get that. So it's, do you call in the fighter plane or not? Or do you, not that we were doing that, but in every major, engagement, there's always the use of force, and then this idea of using the appropriate amount of force, right? Not this idea of, and especially when you're in a place where you've not declared war and you're trying to keep collateral damage to a minimum, and, and civilian casualties, to a minimum, and all that kind of thing. So yeah, that's was certainly a stressful deal. But I was a saw gunner when, as a young Marine, as we were getting called into LA, and they took our saws away from us and gave us M16s, like literally right before we got on the 5 tons to head that way. We're like, this is not even my rifle. I've never even zeroed these sights. So, I mean, what the,
Let me give people some context on that real quick, Chad. So first off, a saw is a machine gun. If you saw it, you would say, oh my God, that's definitely a weapon of war. So they're like, we don't want a bunch of Marines running around downtown LA with machine guns. Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it. Let me give people some context on that real quick, Chad. So first off, a saw is a machine gun. If you saw it, you would say, oh my God, that's definitely a weapon of war. So they're like, we don't want a bunch of Marines running around downtown LA with machine guns. So we're going to hand them what in fact is a machine gun. But, you know, an M16. And if you don't have an M16 zeroed to how you shoot, you may as well be pointing a banana at somebody.
That's exactly right.
You have no reliable way of shooting. And it's not like you can shoot and be like, nope, a little bit left. Nope, a little bit. Like, that's not how it works. So to give you that is to basically say to you, I don't want you shooting anybody.
That's right.
I don't want you to shoot anybody, or you're not going to be able to hit anybody, or what if you shoot the wrong?
Right.
It all sounds bad to me, but
that's right.
But that's what the book dives into, right? To unpack what was. I was right here. It was so crazy during that time. When the verdict was released, the Rodney King riots, the whole city was buzzing all the time during these especially those days coming up till the verdict. And it intrigues me. I wasn't aware or had forgotten that we had Marines stationed in neighborhoods to back up what the police were doing to stave off riots. It was wild. It was terrible. And it was terrible. And we were aware that as a resident of LA, we were all aware that not only the whole country, the whole world was watching the news and saying, these people must be insane. Like, it was a blight to the reputation of Los Angeles, and it was plenty of blame to go around. But for you to offer the details of, pulling back the curtain and revealing a little bit in that hot spot that you were located in Compton is quite interesting to me, and decision-making that went on at that time. I'm asking you to summarize, at the end of the day, looking back on it, was the presence of the Marines in the city of Los Angeles to support the police trying to suppress riots and looting and all that was going on. Was it a good move? Was it at the end of the day, was it a positive or not?
Yeah, I think it was. That's great. You said several things there that really, you actually spooled up some great points. And I'll come back to that. But yes, I would say calling the Marines in there is part of the larger effort to help stop the rioting and stop and really what we saw, we didn't see rioters. What we saw was just the utter devastation of cars burned up and flipped over and buildings completely burned to the ground. And that sort of aftermath, where we were there in Compton, many of the buildings all around us were burned to the ground. And so practically speaking, we prevented this place we were at from being burned to the ground. It was a Korean-owned, indoor flea market deal. And I talk about this in the book. It's actually one of the central themes, certainly, of this section of the book. And not to get too political, but it just is what it is. The social injustice element of that trial. And now I'm a 47-year-old white man from Central Texas, and I will tell you unequivocally that those police officers that beat that man in the street, for whatever reason, he was running from them and he wouldn't pull over or whatever. Pretty sure he didn't kill anybody, right?
No.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure he wasn't fleeing from a mass murder scene. They beat the shit out of that man in a way that, and if that man that was filming that, we talk about now how, it was a precursor to this modern age where everybody's got a camera, everybody's got a cell phone, and, police are wearing body cameras and all this kind of stuff. But that event being caught on videotape like it was, where they were pummeling him with those fucking sticks, you know? And I'm saying that as someone military trained, paramilitary mindset, you know, want some law and order and some structure and all that kind of thing. Those police officers that did that should have been convicted and should have gone to jail. That's me.
I
talking.
agree. Yeah, I agree.
Every single one of them. They had him on the ground, put the handcuffs on him, and get him in the car and get him out of there. But that's not what they did. Okay, so, and we know that because of that trial, you know, the typical profile of these police officers is a guy like me, and this man that gets beat is a black man. And so it turns into, rightfully so, to a degree, it turns into a racial thing. But for me as a libertarian, someone with a kind of a libertarian mindset, I want a small government. I don't like necessarily having these militarized police, but that's where my mind is in that, right? This idea of law and order beating the shit out of citizens and then not being held accountable. And so all of these, let's just call it a debate. This was a very, like you said, Pete, it was being talked about. It was in the air. It was an electric thing. Everyone was following the trial. Court TV, I think, was a new thing at the time, right? This idea of having 24-hour news coverage. And so you're exactly right. I mean, I was really feeling what you said, because, see, we were doing what we were doing. We were training and doing what we were doing in the lead up to the riot. We weren't necessarily paying attention because we didn't watch TV all day, or we weren't as engaged with what was going on in Los Angeles during the trial until the last couple of days before the verdict. Then the buzz started about, man, this might go south. Okay, and so with all these things in mind, in a platoon of humans they all bring their own experiences and their biases and prejudices and stereotypes into the situation. You know, we've got a platoon of young men who are made up of white guys, black guys, Hispanic guys. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so everybody had their own take on justice and injustice and what the fuck we were doing there. And so there was a scab that was picked at in my platoon, and really I think the whole battalion. There was some underlying racial tension that very quickly came to the surface and had to get dealt with. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
And so I describe it in the book as, you know, we went up there and we got the riot all over us, and then we had to take it back to Camp Pendleton with us, right? Yeah. Everybody else got to go about their business. We went up there and I describe it like we were mops. We got taken up there like mops, and we had to mop up all this bullshit, all this injustice and all this racial tension and all this stuff, all this misunderstanding. And then we get shipped back to Camp Pendleton, and we just have to deal with it, right?
Right. Yeah. And
so the riot went with us for several months after that. And I really kind of go into that, you know, a stream of consciousness, you know, really my own observations, and then laying out some anecdotal things that happened, and, you know, and really just a storytelling way of how we dealt with the riot after the riot. And as we were dealing with the riot, this was when the United States then begins to stick their, the old saying of the road to destruction is paved with good intentions. Right. We're high on ourselves as a military power. This is right on the heels of Operation Desert Storm. You know, this 100-hour ground war, lightning war, where we pushed the Iraqi forces very decisively out of Kuwait, and we bombed the shit out of them. And were you a Desert Storm vet?
No, I was after. I was 94.
Okay, I didn't know how old you were, and so my experience personally in the Marine Corps was I was at boot camp when the air war started. You know, I was there during the buildup of this, and we were being told 3 out of 5 of you are going to go over there, and you're not coming home. The Iraqis had used chemical weapons on the Iranians. They had been in a war there on their border for 10 years. They had slugged it out. They were supposedly equipped with basically one of the largest armies in the world, one of the most effective artillery armies, right, of artillery in the world. And so for me, being at boot camp during the air war started within, I had maybe 3 weeks left in boot camp. So you're walking tall, you're already basically 1 foot out the door. You understand how to march and say the right things at boot camp, right? I get to the School of Infantry when the ground war starts and it ends 4 days later, then I get propelled to the, now I check into the units, and all those younger, all those Marines that are really not much older than me had just returned from that epic deployment. And I'm thinking in my head, holy shit, I've already missed this great opportunity, this great adventure. I've already missed it. Surely nothing like this is going to happen, right? And all those guys that had been in Desert Storm, this is where I'm going with this. Those young men were already highly cynical. They were ready to clock out. They had, as we used to say, they already had one pack strap undone, right? Because of the way Desert Storm went down. So these guys are not impressed in the least bit with what's going on in the LA riot. We're still dealing with the riot in Okinawa, Japan by the spring of 92 or so, or 93. And this is when Bush sends in Marines and then Army and then United Nations into Somalia. That's where I was going with this. We were, as a nation, we were really high on ourselves. Look at what we can accomplish. We can use our military to do, nation building or peacekeeping or humanitarian missions and this sort of thing. And, you think you got your head and heart in the right place. And we all know how things went in Somalia after about a year and a half, right?
Right.
And so I touch on those things in the book about how we, what our mindset was as the 21, 22-year-old infantry type who are being asked to do these things and seeing it for what it is and what's the cost, what's the risk, And I think it flows together pretty well between going from the riot and kind of that story and then telling stories throughout the book from the Vietnam War and Desert Storm. And then finally at the end, I tell my story in Somalia. I hope I answered your question.
There you are, young guy, 0311, infantry, and you're in LA. How prepared were you guys for that? That's a complex non-fight fight where, you're trying to keep the place from burning down. You're trying to protect life. But life everywhere around you is in distress, and you can't just start shooting people. So, and then I can't imagine you guys had done much training on partnering with local U.S., police forces. So, how easily could that have gone bad? And were you in any way prepared for that fight?
Okay, so as far as being prepared for that, I think, I think we were highly prepared for the basics of the deployment, which would be, and you had some experience with this in the Army, I'm sure, but just this very basic fundamental of Marines standing a post, right, walking a post left and right, keeping an area secure, staying alert to what's going on around you, right, and then and because we would have 4 hours on a post, 4 hours on a react post in case something went wrong, and then you'd have 4 hours of sleep. This is very universal. Whether we're back at Camp Pendleton, there's always Marines on fire watch or duty non-commissioned officers who are walking the camp. And you understand what I'm talking about, right? Just this basic sense of guarding government property, so to speak. So as far as being prepared to walk posts and things like that, sure, we were more than prepared for that. Mm-hmm. What we weren't prepared for really was, it was almost like the optics of it, or to just use this phrase for the lack of a better phrase in the moment, but just this idea of the emotional impact or, the incongruent nature of what we were doing. It's like, we're standing here. I'm on the corner of this street and this street. I've got an M16 loaded. I've got a bayonet fixed on the end of the rifle. And there's some small kids across the street playing in the yard, trying to carry on with their life like nothing's happened, you know? And we're here in Los Angeles. We're not overseas somewhere, I mean, I'm thankful we didn't have to shoot anything or anybody or do anything like that, that at our worst and on our most naive day, we may think that that's what we want to do, right? I don't think any cop wakes up. Hopefully they're not the kind of cops that are out there looking, they're looking to pull their gun on somebody, right? I mean, these general themes of, hopefully you're not that kind of person that wants to do that. Now, being trained in the infantry, we're certainly, I would be naive or would be lying to say that, especially young Marines who had not yet been to combat, you definitely are trained for it and you definitely want to go get in some shit, right? Mm-hmm. Now, no matter how naive that sounds after the fact, that's not who you were when you're 18 coming right out of the package. When they send a whole unit over to war and none of them have been to war, there may be one or two guys that are the cynical, salty types, and they're trying to warn you about what you're praying for. But the majority of the guys, they want to go get in some shit. They want to prove themselves to themselves and to others.
Right.
Right. And to say anything other than that is just dishonest, right? It really is. So, yeah, I think we were prepared for that deployment as far as some of the very basics of how to guard a post and, how to walk a post, stay alert and be awake and all that kind of thing. There were a lot of mistakes made on the logistical front that actually were being made at the command level. I don't even remember his name, Pete, but our battalion commander was actually relieved immediately when we got back to Camp Pendleton for mismanagement and, things that they were doing wrong kind of at the command level, So, but I think the grunts on the ground, they knew what they were doing. We did the job. A lot of the combat vets there were unimpressed. They were unintimidated by the gangbangers that would drive by and show us AK-47s out the windows, and they'd throw 7.62 rounds out at us on the sidewalk, and we're going to come kill a fucking Marine tonight and all this kind of stuff. We were definitely ready if something was to happen, but thankfully it never did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I just was gonna kind of just pull that together and remind everybody that they can read more. And I've enjoyed this discussion, but it's all about the book Dirty Little War. That sounds like a lot of people that are interested in a number of topics. That this really iconic moment in the history of Los Angeles, the history of our country, and also the interaction of how the military was involved. And that's just part of the book. So I just want to remind people about Dirty Little War. And by the way, how do folks find that book?
Okay, so the dirtylittlewars.com, I went ahead and secured that domain so that I could work with it in the future. But The Dirty Little Wars is available on Amazon in paperback and for Kindle. And it's also available for the Kindle smartphone app, which was new to me. Neat little feature. I was actually reading my book on the Kindle before my paperback copy came, and then once I had the paperback in my hand, that's when I was able to start like page one and read the whole book myself. And like I said earlier, there were big sections in the book that I had completely forgotten about. If they had not been in there, I would have forgotten some key details in some of the stories in there. Just for the audience and for you guys, this is awesome to get to do this. And I said this on the last podcast I was on as a guest, but this book is not really about me.
Right.
That may sound self-serving or, the sense of, and believe me, there is no shortage in this world right now of false humility. When you've got something to be proud of it. Right. And when you need to, humble yourself. But, the sense of trying to sit back and say it's not about me when it really is. But I'm telling you guys, when you read my book, and we're coming up on Veterans Day and, the holidays are around the corner. The book really is about a lot of other people and about the sense of telling stories and how these stories are important to, were important to me personally, but they were important to the Marine Corps. Okay. And without giving it away, I have to think and talk like an author now. And so I can't give it away, so to speak, because, I do want people to buy the book. I want them to read the book. I want it to be enjoyable. But this idea that there are several very kick-ass U.S. Marines that I talk about in this book, and they're not named Chad Cole. I'm talking about warriors and Medal of Honor recipients from the Vietnam War and Marines who were from my hometown that I did not know, but I researched and I kind of created their story and try to honor those men that died in Vietnam and things like that. Like, I want people to read my book, and when they put it down, it compels them to finally go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. and find a name from someone from their hometown and like look it up and see where they're from. And maybe they went to the high school that you went to, or holy shit, they live down the street. You know what I mean? Like, do your own research and let that story kind of come to life for you. That's what this book is about. It's about these collection of stories that were told to me, that I retell to you, or that were told to someone else, or that I read and that I'm elaborating on. Does that make sense? There's several ways you can kind of pass this myth, as I call it, the Marine Corps myth. It's a history that's larger than ourselves. Everybody joins like Pete said this earlier. I wrote it down because every time Pete talks, he just drops knowledge. But he was talking about the team and the veterans on the team, and the one guy was kind of an asshole, and the guy that was more had more skins was more approachable, and he was a better leader. But this idea of being on a team where you put yourself beneath the needs and efforts and goals of the team. I played high school football, and I'm only saying this because it's in the book, but a very large part of the book is about my young days reflecting on high school football, what we learned in football, shortcomings and miscomings. And I actually got to be a part of a team that went undefeated. We lost in the playoffs down the road. Very kind of a heartbreaking, storybook kind of a loss. We had several players that actually went on to play in college and things like that. But this idea of being a part of a team and sacrificing yourself for the good of the team, and those lessons we learned in football, they certainly translated very easily into the Marine Corps, right? And so this idea of giving 110%, if I learned anything in football, I'm still learning those lessons. My head coach passed away several years ago. I haven't seen him since high school, but those lessons still, they just are still right there, right when I need them in my head, telling me how to respond to something or how I'm supposed to handle this moment in adversity, right? I know Pete gets what I'm saying, and I'm just an average guy that played high school football, right? But those lessons that we learn, and then we move forward into I move forward into the Marine Corps, and I'm meeting all these people, and I want to be like, you know what? I'm going to do what I can do to be the star of this team in a way of where everyone can depend on me, or everyone can look to me to make the big plays. That makes sense? Not in a aggrandizing way, but in the way of, all the Marines around me can depend on me the way that our team depended on key people that made the things happen, right when the chips were down and that kind of deal. It's a collection of stories about living up to the myth before us. And it's a universal thing too about men. It's, I speak from the perspective of a Marine, but I think there's a lot of other things in there too that the outsider can appreciate, at least to go, wow. If for no other reason, it sometimes there's some places in the book where I'm just very unplugged, and it can also give a non-veteran a couple of things that they may need to hear about how to approach a veteran, or what a veteran may be thinking, or a combat veteran, what we may think of your perspective on us. Or does that make sense?
Sure.
Like,
for sure.
In the same way that Pete would, probably have some choice words for sports media who say things that they say, right? And they're not in the NFL, that same kind of a thing. So, but yeah, the dirtylittlewars.com, the Dirty Little Wars is right there on Amazon. And I've been having fun with it so far. And I hope I'm, resonating to a degree. And if I say anything that sticks with people, it's the fact that my story is in this book, but this book is not about me. This book is about really all of us. So that's why I'm proud of it, frankly.
Well, we're proud of you, and I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate Pete for setting this up, because it's always fun to record. And I get to see Pete again later this week, so that'll be awesome.
Awesome.
Just from my end of things, man, I appreciate you telling that story, because I just don't know enough about those two conflicts that you had to go through. And even though the book is not about you, it is about those moments in time. And the more I hear about the King riots, I was in California, but I was in the northern part, and I drove a Jeep, and I was worried that I would get yanked out of my Jeep and beaten to death, I was in the Bay. So it was a crazy time, and to know that there are Marines out there makes it even crazier, because gosh, what's a Marine doing deployed to LA? It's a fantastic tale.
Yeah. I tell the story of how we got up there. I had it's a pretty colorful story. And I always say the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, they still owe us a 4-day weekend that they took away from us that week. They never did give us that 96-hour liberty.
I want my pass. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, thanks, man. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to keep following your show. I've listened to several of these shows in the last week or so. I've really enjoyed it. I mean, you had the SWAT guy on and talking about trauma and those things. I mean, you've got a really great podcast. So it's definitely a privilege to get to be a part of this.
Well,
and I thank you, Pete, and I owe you too, Pete, for bringing me on here.
Well, we appreciate you. This has been really educational for me, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.